Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Joining us now via the phone or the computerized phone, Owen Jones, columnist at The Guardian, contributor at Zeteo. Owen, welcome to the program.
Hey guys, you know what? Bit of mysterious, just add a little bit of, I don't know, je ne sais quoi. Sorry I'm hiding. I had a little doctor's thing and I look as demonic as my critics tend to think I am. Well, so I thought that would distract slightly from the content.
We've done most of the show without having the vast majority of our episodes have been like this. So it's no skin off our back, as it were. So, all right. So British elections, give us a sense of where we were 3 weeks ago in terms of what was anticipated was going to happen in English elections. And then maybe you can explain to us exactly how this all works.
So we have this again. We have first past the post. It's an electoral system quite similar to your own, which often gives slightly weird results. So the country, the United Kingdom, is divided into 650 constituencies where they're supposed to have roughly the same amount of voting population, and the winner is the candidate that gets the most votes. So if they win 30% of the vote and they come top, they've won first past the post. That's how it works. You know the drill in terms of, states and your elections and how that works. So Labour was on course for a colossal landslide. That's because the Conservatives just destroyed themselves. No government in democratic history in Britain has ever so comprehensively self-immolated. Whether that be the worst squeeze in living standards this country has had in the modern era, a squeeze in living standards, I should say, that's significantly worse than most of the Western nations. The average Briton is, on average, at least basically around as badly off or worse than 2010. We've seen the collapse of our National Health Service, the public realm in general. We've seen multiple scandals. Boris Johnson collapsing, obviously, his administration in when he broke the rules of the pandemic, when people couldn't hold the hands of their dying relatives. We had Liz Truss, who came to power with a really hard right lunacy, this kind of economic agenda of cut the taxes on the rich. Very unpopular, but that crashed the economy. It sent mortgages and rents going up. So the point I'm making is it's just a unique set of calamities, which meant that the Tories were finished. Some of the polls suggested the Conservatives might actually lose their position as the official opposition, that the Liberal Democrats would take over instead. And it was widely predicted that Labour would get well over 40%. That's what Labour got in 1997 under Tony Blair when they won another landslide. That didn't happen. Labour won a landslide, should be very clear about that. The rules of the game, the electoral system, are you win the seats, you've won the election. It's as simple as that. But Labour won a third of the vote. And in fact, Labour didn't just win a third of the vote in the end. Labour won fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn got in 2019 when Labour was routed. Labour got, as a percentage, a lot less than Jeremy Corbyn got in 2017. They got 40% then. They only got a third this time. And the reason for that is the Conservative Party collapsed. You got the rise of Reform, which is a hard right party, as I'm sure you all know, Nigel Farage, a close associate of Donald Trump with very similar politics. So what was slightly odd about that is you got a landslide, but on a turnout as well, which is the lowest for 23 years. You also got the rise of the best results of the non-Labour left in British history. So the Green Party, who stand on the left prospectus broadly, they got their highest ever vote share. They got about 2 million votes. They only got 4 seats, but that was 4 times more than they had. They came second in dozens of seats, so they're ready to take them off Labour the next time. And you also got independents that won, standing on particularly anti-genocide platforms. So 5 of those won, not just standing on the issue of Gaza. One of them, of course, was Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the Labour Party. He was driven out of the party by Keir Starmer. But you also got 4 independents who often disproportionately won the supports of Muslim voters, but not exclusively. 2 of Keir Starmer's allies lost their seats. Another one, his heir apparent, nearly lost his seat to a young British Palestinian, 23 years old, independent campaign. He didn't even bother campaigning in the seat most of the time. He didn't realise he was in any danger. He nearly lost it by 500 seats. So it was an odd one because they thought, the polling suggested they were getting over 40% of the vote, But they didn't get anything like that. They got way less. And now we've got a lot of client journalists in this country, the kind of sorts of journalists who are not even I mean, it is much worse in this country than the US, by the way, in terms of journalists just crawling up the backsides of the government of the day. And in the case of the Labour Party, a lot of them are just acting, they're claiming, well, actually, this shows the genius of Labour strategy because they may have won a huge majority on a low share of the vote, but that's because they weren't piling up votes in areas they didn't need. The idea they were aiming to get a landslide on 33.7% of the vote is ludicrous, and people comparing it to a Jenga tower. Because if you get a landslide based on such a tiny share of the vote, on such a small turnout, less than 60% voted, around 60% voted, what happens next time when your government, I mean, governments don't generally become more popular when they're in office. So what happens next time? And the question there for Britain is it the hard right Reform Party who are going to swoop in and take a lot of Labour seats? Or could the left, using this as a foundation, get their act together? And I think the left has a lot to be very optimistic and cheerful about in Britain.
Okay. So, all right, and just to be clear on that first past the post, that is whoever wins a plurality, or is there an actual specific number that you need to hit?
Yeah. So you need you need to get first past the post there's 650 seats. To get a majority, you need 325 plus one, obviously. Yeah. Right. So 326 seats, you've got a majority. That can obviously have disproportionate, like in the US, you can win the popular vote and lose the election. Right. So that's happened. For example, Labour in 1950. Well,
I guess I'm asking in specific constituencies, which would be like, I guess the equivalent to our, congressional districts on some level. Is it simply a plurality that you need, or is it a specific number? I mean, theoretically, if you've got 7 people running there, somebody could win with 20%.
You could, if you had 10 people running, we could be hypotheticalized. If you had 20 people running and they almost get the same, that you could win on 6%. Right. Yeah, there's no rule at all. Okay. You just have to get the most amount of votes. That's it. That's how you win the game. So which is why you could be a political party that gets 20% of the vote. And if you get 20% of the vote the same across every single constituency, you will not win a single seat. Whereas you could end up, as an example, the Liberal Democrats, this time round, they got pretty much the same share of the vote as they got last time. But last time round, they only won 11 seats. This time round, 72. They won 72 seats, and they got about the same votes and the same share of the vote. That Labour got almost the same share of the vote as last time. So they got almost the same share of the vote. This time they got 411 seats, and last time they got 202. So they got twice the vote. So they got twice the number of seats on almost the exact same share of the vote, but with fewer votes. I know it's ludicrous, yeah.
No, I mean, it makes some sense. It makes some sense on some level. I'm curious as to where. So if most of the sort of these seats that other parties won, did they all come from the Conservative Party? I mean, or how many? And some of Labor, I guess, went to Green. I mean, it's amazing because Green has the 6th highest vote total, but like the 10th lowest amount of seats. So it gives you a sense that there's a lot of popularity for the Green candidates where they ran. I guess.
Exactly. So for example, YouGov, the pollsters, they did a survey before the election. And what that found was, if tactical voting wasn't at play, what would happen is Labour's share of the vote would plummet. So Labour are inflated by tactical voting. It's important to say that because a lot of people are saying, well, Labour's vote share was so low because of tactical voting, because people were voting for Liberal Democrats, for example. That's not true. According to this poll, Labour's polling goes down by 8 points if people don't think they have to tactically vote to keep out the Conservatives. The Greens double. The Greens actually more than double. The Greens go up to 13% when actually they won 7%. So a lot of people now who would have voted for the Green Party did not vote for the Green Party. And I have to say, the Green Party don't have a visible leadership. Most people voting Green don't know very much about the leadership. They're winning almost blind on the basis that there seem to be a left of Labour political party. They've got 2 co-leaders for a start, and very few people would be able to spontaneously name them. I know them, like Carla Jenny. I think she's very good. So the point, what's interesting is the Greens actually won 2 seats from the Conservatives. They're rural seats, but they're exceptions because they have come second in loads of urban Labour seats. These are seats in inner London, like the one I'm sitting in, where last time round they got about 3%. This time they got 17.5%. They didn't campaign here. So they won they won huge shares of the vote in areas without even bothering to campaign. Because there's a pool of progressive disillusionment with Labour which did not exist in the past. That didn't exist under Tony Blair at all when they came to power. This is a very different situation. There's a very, that's why there's something to build on.
How many? How many seats in Parliament will be held by folks who are to the left of Labour, or would otherwise be in Labour were they not dissatisfied with Starmer's leadership or what they perceive he was going to do?
Difficult one to adequately frame that, because would some of the independents necessarily have joined? I mean, there are 5 independents which you could say are kind of, they're kind of left of Labour candidates. And just to make clear just how difficult that is, or how rare that is, since 1950, there have been 8 successful independent candidates in a general election in which a political party didn't stand down for them, for example. 8. 5 of them were elected last week. So it's really important to make that point, because it's extremely hard under our system to win, obviously, in the same way it is for you in lots of ways, if you're an independent. So it's very rare. And so you get Jeremy Corbyn plus 4 others who are who mostly focused on Gaza, but didn't exclusively focus on Gaza. And they are disproportionately drew from often communities with big Muslim populations. But you also get the Greens 4, so that's 9. But you also get left-wing Labour MPs. They did try to start purging them all, but they didn't succeed in that. So, for example, Jeremy Corbyn's shadow chancellor, his right-hand man, John McDonnell, when Jeremy was leader, he's still an MP. Zawal Sultana, a young, sort of compared to the kind of squad in the US, she's still a Labour MP. Nadia Whittome, Clive Lewis, these are left-wing Labour MPs. So you actually do get, there are now, I don't know, there are probably 30 left-wing members of parliament without going into what I would call the soft left. So you do have a contingent now of maybe 30 to 40 left-wing MPs. I mean, there's a Scottish National Party who had a battering. They were dominant. I think a lot of people maybe often saw them as left-wing, in which you do get left-wing SNP MPs, but they're civic nationalists. They're focused on independence. You also get Plaid Cymru, who are a Welsh nationalist party with about 3 MPs, who also stand on the left. They're a left-wing nationalist party. But yeah, I think there's a contingent, a larger contingent than expected. I think that's the way to put it.
And can you explain to the audience what has been happening with Labour, the hollowing out of the left post Jeremy Corbyn, which might give people a sense of why there's dampened enthusiasm, even though on paper, obviously, Labour won?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, to be honest with you, if they thought Labour, they were only going to get 33.7% of the vote, they would have been devastated by that and terrified, I would imagine. And what happened is Keir Starmer stood in 2020 on the basis that he was basically going to be a professionalised Jeremy Corbyn. He stood on a very similar domestic prospectus: tax the rich, public investment, nationalisation of utilities, abolish tuition fees for students, don't support illegal wars, have human rights, the sense of foreign policy, reverse privatisation of the National Health Service. I mean, he U-turned on the whole lot. He also promised the broad church and then started to purge the left and change the leadership rules to try and stop the left ever being able to stand for the leadership of the Labour Party ever again. But also started, when the election started, they tried. For example, they purged someone called Faiza Shaheen, who was a left-wing Labour candidate who would have won under the Labour banner on the left. They saw her as a kind of AOC. She's young, she's a very talented, charismatic, telegenic working class woman of color who defied the odds, became a very successful economist. So huge numbers of people on the left have left the Labour Party, including people who voted for Keir Starmer under on a false pretense, I suppose. So what happened is you've got a mass exodus of people on the left from the Labour Party. What's interesting actually is there's been this again caricature, I suppose, of, you get this over there, don't you? But is, the left are kind of like bourgeois bohemians and they're students and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And Keir Starmer actually, unlike Tony Blair, who never spoke about class and thought talking about class was bad, and Keir Starmer appropriated the idea of class politics, but often to batter the left. Kind of portraying the working class as socially conservative, wave a load of flags, talk about migrants in a pejorative way. That's how you win them over. And what's interesting is the polling shows that Labour lost support in areas of deprived communities. That's where they lost support, principally, poorer communities. The reason they got over the line in the end in the way they did is, the Conservative vote collapsed. They got their worst number, the lowest number of seats since they were founded in their modern form in 1832. And that's partly because of the Reform Party to their right, but the Reform Party don't just, of course, take Conservative votes, they also take Labour votes, unfortunately, as well. And you also had a drop in turnout. But what's happened is the Labour leadership now stand for, they oppose taxing the rich. They're to the right of Biden on economic policy. I think it's very, I should just be very straightforward about that. They had one distinctive policy, which was modelled on Bidenomics, which is a £28 billion a year clean investment fund through borrowing, but they dropped that. They trashed it. And on Gaza, they stood for, Keir Starmer backed the right of Israel to cut off energy and water to civilians, then gaslit everyone and claimed he'd never said that. He's the most dishonest politician of our age alongside Boris Johnson. He lies and lies and lies, and the media facilitate that. It is absolutely astonishing behavior. So I think what's interesting is, he's less popular. He's the least popular leader of the opposition to ever win a general election, by a long way, I should say. He's less popular than Jeremy Corbyn was in the 2017 election. I know people go, look, well, good. Losers don't win any prizes. He might be, Labour got a higher share of the vote. They got a lot more votes. Jeremy Corbyn was more popular. You lost. Get over it. I get that. Fine. But the point is, they are starting from a level of extremely low enthusiasm. They only won by default. That's why they're in power. They lost because they won because the Conservatives lost. And the reason that's a problem is this country's in its worst mess since 1945, when it was reduced largely to rubble by the Nazis. For example, at the moment, we've got a looming £20 billion a year black hole in the nation's finances. If that's not filled, notwithstanding an aging population, that means more cuts on top of the cuts we've already had. And Labour's ruled out it hiking taxes, and they've kept the same fiscal rules as the Conservatives. So what are they going to do? They're going to, they're already not popular. They're popular amongst newspaper columnists, my colleagues, they love them, but they're not actually popular amongst the general population. They've won by default in a very difficult situation without answers to the country's problems. That's the issue.
So where do they go? I mean, they have a governing majority, a sizable one. So they'll be able to presumably execute, a political program. I guess, what is your sense as to which direction they go? Because I'm just thinking about, in this country, obviously it's a very different system. The last president we had to win not a majority, I mean, aside from our electoral college stuff, but I mean, I'm just thinking back to the Clinton era, where Clinton won with 45% of the vote. And it basically brought about a strategy called triangulation. Now, it doesn't work the same way. He doesn't need necessarily. I mean, it sounds to me like Labor doesn't necessarily need to go to the progressive bloc if they become a bloc, or a left bloc, they become a bloc for votes. But where do they tact ideologically? Do they see more opportunity in getting more votes from sort of like conservative, from Tory voters who might be, disaffected with a completely sort of, I guess, a diminished party or what? I mean, where do you have a sense of where they'll take this if they're aware of their weakness?
Well, it's a very good question, isn't it? Because, I mean, the Conservative rump now, given it's only 23.7% of the vote, I mean, that really is what is left. That's the kind of hardcore Conservative till I die, isn't it, really? I don't really see how you scrape from that. Reform would actually, you could argue more likely in that you will have parts of that will be working class voters who are disillusioned and have been won over in this case by a right-wing anti-migrant agenda. But, if we go back to 2015, Farage's then party, UKIP, did very, very well. Theresa May, the Conservative Prime Minister, called an election in 2017 expecting those voters would just vote for the Tories and therefore Labour would lose very badly. But actually, Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party won over a lot of Farage's supporters in 2017. Of course, voters don't work on a left and right basis. They're often disillusioned with the system, and it's which politician who are you most convinced with who expresses that disillusionment. The problem is Keir Starmer. I don't see why Keir Starmer's leadership would ever appeal to them. And the issue, a former Blair advisor called John McTernan, he actually said, well, look, actually, we need to look at the votes lost over Gaza in the same way we looked at those lost over Brexit, because Labour lost working class voters, not just working class voters, but voters in Northern England and the Midlands over Brexit, and then everything was thrown at winning them back. And he's saying we need to do the same over Gaza. The problem with that is the people at the top of the Labour Party are just, they will think to themselves, if voters are disillusioned because they think there are too many migrants, that's a legitimate concern. If voters are angry about Israel committing genocide in Gaza, that isn't a legitimate concern. That's what they don't, these people are ideologically pro-Israel. These are the sorts of people who, that wing of the Labour Party, the sorts of people, when Eurovision's on, they'll dress up waving the Israeli flag to piss off the left. These people hate the left. They're actually different from New Labour's founders in the sense they're just obsessed with hating on the left. They don't have any interest in understanding voters who've peeled off. And I think that's why they're hubristic. I don't see how they're going to win back, because Tony Blair pissed off a lot of, for example, Muslim voters, but that took years, had Iraq and all the rest of it. Keir Starmer did that before he was even in power. So a lot of Labour's electoral coalition, younger progressives plus Muslims, we have a larger contingent of younger progressive people. Urban areas have moved to the left compared to where they used to be under New Labour. And that's because you have a housing crisis and lots of younger people in insecure jobs, and the living standards have been done over. So they're receptive to a more progressive argument. But Keir Starmer's leadership isn't interested in catering to that. I mean, the programme they've got at the moment, they're throwing everything at a house building programme, which is basically funneling a huge amount of money to private developers. That's their argument for growth. That's how they think they'll get growth back. That they will override Conservatives who are NIMBYs, not in my backyard, and build a lot of housing. The problem is this country hasn't built the houses we need, except in the era when we had the public sector building housing, but they're not proposing to do that. So I think the problem is they don't actually have this. A Labour advisor told me in the election, if you're thinking there's some big grand plan hiding in a drawer somewhere, you're going to be disappointed. I don't think they expected independents and Greens to do as well as they did. I don't think they realise more people are going to defect to them because people get pissed off with governments in office, and they were already pissed off before they were even in charge. A lot of people voted Labour to keep the Conservatives out. Now the Greens are in second place in dozens of seats. A lot of those voters will go, well, actually, it's a choice between the Greens and the Labour Party. Now I can choose the Greens safely. So I don't think they've got a plan for that. But equally, I think Reform could take a lot of their seats. Someone joked on Twitter, went viral in Britain, you can see why, last week. They said, I'm looking forward to watching the British 2029 general elections this Sunday. They were, of course, referring to the French elections. And a lot of the people who are cheering on Macron blindly did the same, cheered on Starmer, cheered on Macron when he became president. They called him the antidote to populism. They said that's what we need here in Britain. Well, Macron oversaw, of course, the rise of the far right. And it was only the left which stopped the far right taking over for the first time since the defeat of Vichy France and the Nazis. So, I mean, unless the left gets their act together, that is, I think, our fate. I think the reform they're second place behind Labour now in 89 seats.
So, Owen, can you tell us more about reform? I mean, you mentioned that he's, people are probably familiar with Nigel Farage and that he's a Trumpian-like figure aligned with Trump. But what are some of their policies? What are they advocating? Is it basically just anti-migrant hate? Is that kind of their central premise right now?
Well, that's their core. I mean, Nigel Farage came to prominence campaigning to leave the European Union. In practice, despite the critiques of people like myself on the left of the European Union about neoliberalism, that referendum centered on the question of freedom of movement. Because if you're a member of the European Union, you have freedom of movement throughout the European Union. And the argument was an anti-migrant argument. So he, in 2015, they did really well. They were called UKIP at the time. Then you had the referendum. So in the 2017 referendum, Farageism, that bubble popped because a referendum had been won by Leave, so people didn't see the need to vote for his party anymore. Why did he come back, I suppose, is the question. Well, I mean, it's interesting. Immigration is higher in Britain than it's ever been, which I think is great, by the way. It's good for our economy and it's good for our society. It's a good thing. But if you voted to leave because you hated immigration, then obviously you find that slightly perverse. And attitudes towards immigration overall in Britain have got a lot better. There's no correlation between anti-migrant sentiments in Britain and the level of immigration, but a core of Britain hates immigration. And what the government did is focus on the question of small boats crossing the English Channel from France. These are a very small proportion of the overall numbers arriving. They tend to be English speaking, often from former colonies of Britain. The biggest source is Afghanistan. Britain obviously had one or two things to do there in this century. The Conservatives focus through everything at that. Stop the boats, stop the boats, stop the boats. All they succeeded in is whipping up a lot of people to get very angry about migrants and refugees without doing anything to actually satisfy them, and that radicalized a lot of them, and they ended up going to reform on the basis that immigration is their number one issue. They feel lied to by the Conservatives, and they want to stop the boats. When you ask people, I mean, some of them, you ask them, they say, look, shoot them all. There is that. But, there are a lot of them. Yes, the core of reform, I don't think most people know anything about their policies. They do have a manifesto. I think they just think, I don't like immigration. That's, I think, probably at the moment that's the driving force. The people aren't voting for any other meaningful reason, no.
And Owen, give us your sense of where are folks regarding Brexit? Like, what? Like, has there been? I mean, how are you mentioned that if you had voted for leaving on the basis of you did not want more immigrants, you'd be rather disappointed at this point. What about the whole rest of the agenda? Where does that sit now? And and if there's been any type of like backlash, has there been any accountability or what?
Yeah, I mean, there were lots of promises made about Brexit. The focus, of course, was about immigration, which is that was the biggest single reason why people wanted to leave. There's no question about that. And as I say, net immigration now is higher than it's ever been, which is very funny. To be honest, that amuses me. It doesn't obviously amuse a hardcore in this country. But there was also, I guess, a lot of people also saw it as a vote against the status quo. They saw it as a vote against, people looked at that referendum question rather than, do you want to remain a member of the European Union? They saw it as, are you happy with the status quo? Are you happy with your life? And a lot of people voted no. And a part of that, the NHS was put at the forefront of that. There was a promise on a bus that there will be £350 million extra for the National Health Service every month or every week, something absurd like that. That became very famous and totemic because the National Health Service has just been in a mess and got worse and worse and worse. So I think the general issue is a lot of people voted for Brexit thinking it would make their lives better. And actually, since then, people's living standards actually suffered a worse squeeze. And the likes of the National Health Service, because of Tory policies, have been hammered. Broadly on Brexit, what we ended up with was the worst possible deal. It was a hard Brexit deal negotiated by Boris Johnson's team, which has caused a lot of economic problems. I mean, it has just it's hit the economy. There's no question about that. You know, these are people who pushed it, often right-wing libertarians, who go on about red tape, but in practice it means red tape. It just, if you want to trade with the biggest trading bloc on earth, it's just much harder now. You have to do lots of complex forms, to get things back and forth. There are barriers in place. There are now trade barriers. So it's very unpopular. I mean, the polling shows both Leavers and Remainers think it's been a disaster. And I guess, I think reopening the question would be, it'd just be a culture war again, because it became a culture war. It was so toxic for the left, because for us, our understanding of politics is there is the working class, or the majority versus the elite. But all of a sudden, everyone was a Remainer or a Leaver. It was utterly toxic and had a catastrophic impact on the Corbyn project as a result. So I don't want to reopen that, and I don't think the left should. And I think the best bet is to come up with a new deal which is closer and tries to deal with those issues. But it has actually, I guess the problem is a lot of people voted for that thinking, I don't like the way the country's run. I'm not happy with my life. And since then, things have only got worse. And that's dangerous in that, well, I mean, there's potential in that if you get a left which gets its act together, it can speak to people and say, well, actually, the reason is because of the economic system. But the danger is you just get a right-wing populist movement who say Brexit wasn't done properly, and we need to get rid of this corrupt elite to make it work.
Lastly, so how does it work? The next elections, British elections, will be in 2029, or they have to be done by essentially this time in 2029?
They can be held no later than the 15th of August 2029. But in practice, that doesn't have to be the case. I mean, the latest this election could have been was next January, and obviously we're in July. Actually, that was completely mad by Rishi Sunak. I don't know why he went so early. If he'd waited, Farage could have just gone off to the United States for the elections with Trump and, just pissed around with him. That would have been, your issue, not ours. But for some reason, but instead Farage stayed here and then launched, a big campaign, which did over the Conservatives. I mean, Rishi Sunak, I don't know if he's an agent of the Labour Party, but I don't know how else he would have, what would he have done differently? But yeah, so it can be before then. I guess a lot of people, the hubris of these people, I think is just worth returning to, because when Boris Johnson won an 80-seat majority in 2019, a lot of commentators were like, well, Boris Johnson's going to be Prime Minister for the next 15 years. He's master of all before him. Look at him. And the press was swooning over him. Boris Johnson was in power for about 2.5 years, and then he was overthrown in disgrace. We have had now in this country 30% of our post-war prime ministers in the last 8 years. With no change in government, 30% of our post-war prime ministers in 8 years. We live in an age of turmoil and tumult, and I think a lot of people, it was the same. You know what this syndrome was, guys, because it was the politics will be boring again. We can all go back to brunch. That's what made people passionate about Starmerism. Everything's just been this terrible nightmare. We just need the grown-ups back in the room. The adults will be back in the room. Politics will become boring. We can all go back to the 2012 Olympic ceremony when we had this great opening ceremony and everyone lived in utopian paradise, because we don't care about all the people who are struggling who don't live in, because this was often about middle class, privileged people in Britain, where politics had never intervened in their lives. And they were like, this is all awful. Make things boring again. And they saw the Tories as vulgar and embarrassing. They didn't really care about the substance of their policies. They were embarrassed. They're embarrassed to go to their second homes in Europe. And people go, oh my God, your government's such a shambles. The point I'm making is, I think those who think stability will now return to Britain, which is, that whole kind of British exceptionalism. Europe is where all the mad populists are. Britain is stable. I don't know if you've seen that. What's that film? Children of Men. The rest of the world has collapsed. Britain, soldiers on. Britain is in a mess. It's in a terrible mess. And Labour doesn't have the answers to the problems. Keir Starmer is a budget Macron. He's a budget Tony Blair. They don't have the talent of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. I'm not complimenting, Blair. I think he's a war criminal, but I just mean this, in terms of them as politicians.
Right.
I think this will end badly. I think it will end very badly. And my fear is it will be the far right, which will benefit. So it's got to be the left that gets their act together. France shows that can be done, even though they're not out of the woods in France. The far right could still end up running that place. I wouldn't rule that out. But I think the left has something to build on. And I think the left is actually feeling more optimistic now than they felt certainly in the last 5 years.
Owen Jones, columnist at The Guardian, contributor at Zeteo. Thanks so much for your time today. We're going to link to a couple of pieces that you've written in the wake of the elections. One in particular, comparing what happened in France with what may be possible, at least broadly in England. And we will link to that at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time. It was great talking to you.
No, it's an honor, guys.
Thanks Owen.
Take care.
Great to talk to
Take
you.
care, everyone. Speak soon. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.